Hello, everyone. I'm Brandon Truitt. I'm head of learning community engagement here at the Zimley Art Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for a really fabulous conversation between Nicky Michael and Camilla Townsend about their new book, On the Turtle's Back: Stories Lenape Told Their Grandchildren, out soon from Rutgers University Press. So this is the third installment of our fall series on Indigenous Arts and Culture. The previous two are on our YouTube page if you weren't able to see them live. And then we have one more coming up in November with Michelson on November 16th. I also want to begin by reading our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the land on which we stand is ancestral territory of the Lenape people. We pay respect to Indigenous people throughout the Lenape diaspora, past, present, and future, and honor those that have been historically and systematically disenfranchised. We also acknowledge that Rutgers University, like New Jersey and the United States as a nation, was founded upon the exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. So before I pass the mic on to Raven Minigoats, who will introduce our speakers tonight, I also want to acknowledge our generous funders for making this series possible. That is the Middlesex County Board of Commissioners through a grant award from the Middlesex County Cultural and Arts Trust Fund. Additional support is provided by the New Brunswick Parking Authority. Raven Minigoats, who I'm proud to bring up here in a second, is a PhD student in the History Department and a founding member of Rutgers Indigenous Studies Working Group. Her research focuses on Native American women's activism in the late 20th century. Raven currently also serves as the graduate assistant in the Arts of the Americas at the Zimmerle.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome two speakers, Dr. Camilla Townsend and Dr. Nicky Michael, to discuss their new book, On the Turtle's Back: The Stories the Lenape Told Their Grandchildren. Dr. Townsend is a Board of Governors Distinguished Professor of History here at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. Some of her previous publications include Pocahontas and the Powhatan Dilemma and Fifth Son, A New History of the Aztecs, which won the 2020 Kundal Prize in History. Dr. Nicky Michael is a Delaware tribe member who earned her BA from Stanford and her PhD from the University of Oklahoma. She is the interim president of Bacone College in Muskogee, Oklahoma, where she is also the executive director of Indigenous Studies and Curriculum. Additionally, she serves as a member of the Delaware Tribal Council. So first, we'll hear from Dr. Townsend and then Dr. Michael before they enter into a joint discussion between each other. We'll then end with a Q&A with the audience. So please welcome Dr. Townsend first.
Well, it's really a delight to be here. Of course, I'm very familiar with Rutgers, having been here for many years, but I'm not usually in the position of giving a talk here. We're here to talk about this new book that we have written together, put together, but we don't have a single copy of the book, we've realized. Okay, what we do have, thanks to Peter McCoulis, the editor from the Rutgers Press, is a what would you call it, Peter? A sheet, a coupon. You can get the book sent to you free of charge, no postage, for $16, which is a slashed price. Okay, and I think they're stacked up at some table back there, right? So in lieu of any copies of the book, you can get a hold of one that way, should you be interested. So without further ado, I approach this topic in a sort of an unexpected way. I actually am someone who studies the Nahuas, the people who spoke the Nahuatl language, or the Aztecs in your sort of mental universe. But in 2016, the administration of the university decided that in honor of the 250th anniversary, they wanted to really reckon with disenfranchised people in Rutgers history. They were thinking mostly of African Americans, but the deans came up with the idea, and Deborah Gray White, a historian in my department, strongly seconded it, that we needed to look at the history of Native American exclusion also in the founding of Rutgers. Now, I knew from my teaching, though not from my research, that the Lenape in that era, that is up to the 1760s when Rutgers was founded, had not written much. There were some letters from Lenape students who were not allowed to come to Rutgers and instead were sent off to a boarding school in Connecticut. But other than that, very little that they had written. So I started to wonder, well, after they were pushed westward, after they were ejected from the state in that period, did they perhaps write in their own language later when they were in the Whoops. Oh, thank you. It's someone else is turning the lights down. I thought I was doing something wrong. Okay. So in that period, when they were in the process of being pushed ever further westward, had they perhaps written something? And indeed, following the sort of obscure footnote, so to speak, I ended up in the archive of the Smithsonian, particularly the archive of the National Museum of the American Indian, where I was looking at the papers of an anthropologist who had lived in the greater metropolitan area, Mark Harrington, and you see him there on the far right. In some of his, as he called them, travels and adventures. Now, remember, this was someone in the early 1900s. Here he was with indigenous people in the Caribbean. Now, these papers included some significant files, about 10 fat files from the Lenape, or Delaware, as they had come to be called, because they lived so long along the Delaware River, and the English people preferred to say the Indians of the Delaware River rather than calling them by their true name, the Lenape. He had these files, and where had he gotten them? He had gotten them out in Oklahoma. This is a map from that era of Bartlesville, Oklahoma. He was working for a man, George High. Some of you may know him as the founder of the museum that we now know of as the National Museum of the American Indian. He was working for him as a collector, and this George High sent him out there knowing that there were Lenape, or Delaware people, living in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. You're seeing a sort of a bustling proto-metropolis here, as it was at that time. Oklahoma, as you know, was soon to be involved with the discovery of oil. We'll all be going to this movie soon, right, about the Osage. But in any event, in the outskirts of this town, in the far distance where you see those hills, were small communities of people who were Delaware or Lenape. Now, how had they come to be there? Well, as many of you know, but not all, and I want to make sure we all understand what we're talking about here tonight, they had started in the New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia area, as you see, and after, well, really it was after the Dutch were defeated by the English that they began to be pushed further west. By the time of the American Revolution, they were mostly living in western Pennsylvania and Ohio. After the Revolution, they were pushed into Indiana and Illinois. Eventually, they were asked to move to Missouri. From there, they went to Kansas, and then finally, in the 1860s, landed where they still are today, in the Bartlesville area of Oklahoma. Individuals were allowed to stay anywhere they wanted to, and some did. But if they wanted to hold together as a tribe, if they wanted to continue to elect chiefs and have sovereignty over their own territory, have their own rules, speak their own language, then they had to move ever further west as the settlers took the land. Okay? So, when our anthropologist, M.R. Harrington, was out there, he was mostly trying to buy sacred objects. And this may make us wince. It should make us wince. It's not what we would want to think of him as doing, talking impoverished people out of holy items in exchange for money for the museum. But he wasn't actually an evil guy. He was an interesting guy. And several Native Americans said to him, well, I'm not going to sell you anything, but I will tell you a story. Do you want to hear it? And Harrington said yes, even though that was not what he'd been sent for. There was no money in it for him. Among them were several Lenape or Delaware people. Charlie Elcare, pictured here with one of his grandsons, was famous at the time. Again, this is early 1900s, for always leading the prayers, always speaking Delaware or Lenape at funerals, and being an awesome storyteller. His wife, Susan Washington Elcare, was known for also telling stories, beautiful craft work. Harrington took this picture, and if you can, I don't know if you can see, it's actually a folded up, sort of crumpled sheet at her feet. And in the book, you'll find the photograph as it really was. They were kind of laughing about it, Harrington and she. Someone was holding up the sheet behind her so that he could get a photo with a white background. Okay, this was before Photoshop, and he needed this. Okay, so, sort of a classic, let's make up an image of Native Americans. But she was participating in this. She wanted the world to see these beautiful things that she had made. This is their son, Jesse Elcare, after the deaths of Susan and Charlie. To this day, there are, dozens, actually probably a couple of hundred, right, Nicky, of Elcare descendants in Oklahoma, some of whom I've met and probably all of whom Nicky knows. Okay. Now, Oh, can you see that, or is that out of focus for you? Okay. When I first met Nicky and other Delaware people in Oklahoma, they said to me, I bet you anything that they, the indigenous people, the Lenape, were the ones who were really pushing for a continued collection of stories, and not perhaps Harrington. Remember, Harrington was there to make some money by buying these objects and bringing them back and selling them to George High. His files are full of stories. He painstakingly wrote down a couple of dozen, and then many or several more, probably many is a better word, about 10 more were sent on via the mail and ended up in his files in the museum. And here's a letter from one of the Lenape, Julius Fouts, who dictated it to his son. We know this because his own handwriting looked quite different. Here it says, Mr. M.R. Harrington, my dear friend, I thought I would send you a few lines of this story. My boy got back from school, he means boarding school, and I told him to send it down. So he's dictating the letter, and then he dictates the story. So the Lenape people in Oklahoma said to me, I betcha that they were the ones insisting on this, because there are too many stories for this to have been an accident and sort of all the idea of someone who wasn't even in the state for that purpose. And indeed, when I then followed up at a different museum's archive where they had further correspondence, it's full of letters of correspondence indicating that the indigenous people wanted him to publish a book of their stories. That is, that they asked him repeatedly, why is it taking so long? Why haven't you published these stories? So I took the stories, the idea, and through an acquaintance, approached the Delaware Council out in Oklahoma. This is the council meets near the Caney River. This is the river along which Charlie Elker's property lay. And Nicky, whom I hadn't met before, who has a PhD in history, was then the head of American Indian Studies at Bacone and has since become the president of the college, said, I would like to see this book exist. I will work with you. And she has. Okay, what she has helped me do is not only finish, in a sense, the translation, because some of the words and phrases were still in Lenape, but more importantly, she took the story and brought it to the present day. If you look at the book, the stories end about 2/3 of the way through, and the rest of the book brings their lives up to today. So what happened to the storytellers later? They had lives, long lives. What happened to their descendants? Nicky, when she was a younger woman, interviewed some of Elker's grandchildren or great-granddaughters and plenty of other people in the community, and some of those interviews and writings about those interviews appear in the book as well. Okay? This painting is by a Delaware woman who's still alive in Oklahoma, Ruth Blalock, and she is in fact the daughter of one of the last fluent speakers, Lucy Blalock, who was the teacher of Nicky. Through her, Nicky came to speak Lenape and is now, I think, the last person teaching the language. Okay? So that's all you need to know from me, sort of how did this Rutgers professor end up helping to write this book about, or collect these stories from the Lenape people. The rest of the time we will devote to Nicky herself talking about her life and her people's lives out in Oklahoma, and then we hope to talk both to each other and most importantly to you. Okay? So Brendan, I think I will ask your help because you said press escape, which I have now done. But I will let you do the next step because Nicky's PowerPoint is right beneath mine, right? So take it away.
Nula Lindam. I'm very pleased to be here. And Kutalewensi, Opatayahwe, Lenape ni, Neguis. Does it need to be louder? I could start over. Nula Lindam. There we go. Nula Lindam. It means I'm happy to be here. Delawinsi, Opatayahwe, Lenape ni. I'm a Lenape woman. My Indian name is White Flower Woman. I don't know why they named me that. Neguis, Ampekinun, Ok Tahkoken, Ok Shakakahane. I'm a mother to 3 boys that are mine by birth, and then I have 3 more boys that have taken in. And I just told you that I'm their mother and that I gave you their names and that To me, the reason that I always do that in wherever I'm at, whether it's the classroom or in front of people or just being at home, is because in our culture, in our ways, the women have a certain status. And that status comes from the fact that we can give birth. We're life givers. We continue the culture by giving birth. We continue our ways by giving birth. And then we are moms. That's the first thing we do. So wherever I go, if my kids call me, I'm picking up the phone. I'm texting because that is my most important job. And with that, I learned to be a mom by being a Lenape woman. So with that, I'm going to go through this as quickly as possible because we really have a lot more to talk about, and we want to hear from the audience, and we want to have an exchange. But I do want to give you some culture and some context. So it's not just the Delaware tribe in Bartlesville, which is what we focused on, because the Bartlesville, Delaware, we were the ones that had the Hinguicaun. We were the ones that had the church. We were the ones that carried on the doll dance and all of the social dances. So the other one, though, is our sister nation. That's the Delaware Nation, and they are about 2.5 hours away from us. So we'll get to the reason why in just a few minutes. They told me I couldn't erase the slide because it was funny, and and it's really still pretty true. I had the jet lag, and so I'm still here, and hopefully I make sense when I'm speaking because, when you're jet lagged, things come out of your mouth that you weren't expecting. All right, so I just want to share that in 2017, which is when I actually wrote the slideshow, or 2023, or 1623, our roles were the same, honestly, very much the same. We were making baskets, we were caring for our families. And that is the perspective I'm always going to come from. Most of the time we know men are in the archives because they're the ones that are doing the writing, or they're the ones that people are writing about. But the women tend to be a little bit more subsurfaced, hidden. And especially when it comes to indigenous perspectives, because you have them buried, and the European way of thinking was that they didn't have very strong roles, or that they were more like drudges, or, there's even the word, anybody know what the S word I'm going to say? The word for a woman, an Indian woman? Squaw. Squaw, yeah. But it actually comes from the word hui, which is woman, hui. Woman. Somehow it morphed into squaw, because the Europeans heard it one way. And it actually, it's not a negative term in our language. It's a beautiful term. But in European minds, it turned into something very derogatory over time. So that's why people don't like the word, and that's why a lot of folks have tried to also get rid of that as a derogatory name. All right, so one of the things I just want to acknowledge is that, we remember the first treaty. We remember that treaty very well. We were promised in 1778 that we would have somebody go to Congress, that we would be the front of a Native American state, and as the Delawares, we were the original Algonquin tribes. Everyone called us the grandfathers. That's because Algonquin language comes from the Lenape. Now, there's a long history after that of all the tribes that come with us, and we don't have time for that today. But instead of acknowledging what the Delawares did in supporting the revolution, and supporting, not everybody did, but a number of our people did, support the Americans in their quest to be free from the English. And instead of honoring this treaty, we were moved repeatedly, about 10 times. So, since we just had this one, I'm not sure why it's up there again, and I'm not sure. Oh, I know why I'm doing that, because I'm pushing the wrong button. Okay, and then here's another one. I want to acknowledge the fact that I've had historians tell me this didn't happen. You know what gaslighting is? Yeah, that's where you know it happened, and you have a lot of stories about what happened as a result of them giving us those things. That is called gaslighting in history. Basically, they did give us diseases. They did give us smallpox blankets, and you can read that. And so a number of our folks were decimated. Our cultures were decimated. Our people died as a result of this. And so our numbers grew small from a pretty early era. And real quickly, I'm going to go through the rest of these slides pretty fast because I want to get to the part where we see the more current day. But I also want to acknowledge the fact that Lenape women were really important. They also grew and collected food. They fished. Sometimes they hunted if they needed to. But what's important about this is 1491. What's 1492? Right. Christopher Columbus. Yeah, that song. Well, 1491, he wasn't here yet. We were on a verge of a cultural revolution, agricultural revolution as well. Women were the farmers. They did the gardening. They did the farming. Back in this day, 1491, anywhere on the North American continent, you would find that they were able to produce more per acre than today's commercial farmers. Let that sink in. And that was undisturbed land. They didn't have to plow it. They didn't have to. This was like the Three Sisters type of work where you would put corn, beans, and squash together. But they also knew a lot of other tricks of the trade. So I just want to acknowledge that because my Delaware ancestors were some of those who did it. And think about that for a second. What would that mean to a young Native girl? Kindergartner. To have someone say, your grandma was a scientist. What do you think most Indian girls are told today? Yeah. All right, so let's get to the current day. This is Archingwikam. Did you know it was pronounced that way? She's tried, and she's done a really good job of pronouncing things. I try not to correct people because our language is really hard. Really. This is our messing, and that's the spirit of the game owl. And this is the actual original church that it used to be. Today that church is in museums and pieces throughout the United States. In the 1940s was the last year they had it. They said that when we had it, when we prayed, no Delawares were killed in action in World War II. That's the last we had of it. After that, the Boy Scouts came in and tore it down. And I don't know how and why, and it's a mystery of how all those pieces came to be in different places. But we're trying to bring it back together. Okay, so this is the inside of the church. And in the stories that you see in the book or read in the book, you can see some of the lines that they're talking about. And then here you see a very important figure. Now, Camilla was talking about Killers of the Flower Moon, and it's a really important movie that's coming out, and it's about the Osage. But this is a Lenape girl. How many have ever got their gas from Frank Phillips? Phillips Petroleum. Raise your hand. If you buy gas, period, you're getting gas from Phillips Petroleum. Period. Okay, raise your hand again. That's more like it. That's more like it. This little girl, full-blood Delaware, the reason that I say that is because Frank Phillips became her, quote, guardian. She had full-blood parents, and so they were, quote, they were not capable, basically. They were restricted from being able to take care of their own child because they were full-blood. That's what happened in this day and age. And so as a result, Frank Phillips became her guardian by court, and he had control of her allotment. and as a result, founded the first oil well in Oklahoma.
So did he know there was oil on her land when he took
No,
custody of her?
no. Mm-mm. What they would do was get a whole bunch of children that they could become guardians of. So he had a whole slew of others.
And then they tested their land to see who had oil. I see.
So what they don't tell you in Killers of the Flower Moon is that the Delaware women ended up going and working for the Osage women, but that's another story. Today, this is what our women look like. We've got this woman right here who went up to Standing Rock, and she stayed all the whole, what is it, 9 months? The whole stand. And that was no easy feat because this is South Dakota, and it's really cold and blizzardy. So they stayed in tents and protested that. We've got women warriors who went to battle, who actually wear the uniform today. That's Sarah. She is actually one of the Killbuck descendants. Anybody know who Killbuck is? That's right. Yep, that's them. Some of them you may see in buckskin or different regalia because we have 10 different tribes a lot of times. A lot of our young people, of course, boarding schools and intermarriage created some differences in some of our regalia, but here are some Lenape women. And then here's kind of a trajectory of some of the old in the 1900s, Grandma Jackson. She's also a fall leaf and elk hair descendant. That's Red Day Johnson, and she is carrying her baby much in the same way. See, things change, but they stay the same. Here are some of our ceremonial. Those are my turtles that we wear when we're stomp dancing. Stomp dancing is done all through the night, not during the day. It's because we had to hide our dances. It was illegal to do these things, and so oftentimes we would do them at night so we wouldn't get caught. Here is Nora. In the 1970s, we were doing what's called the bean dance. It should ring a bell, corn, beans, and squash. The bean is the vine that grows up the corn. And so when we're doing our dances, we're holding hands, often emulating a bean vine. And that energy is going around through each person. That's what makes a tribe. That's what makes us who we are. That energy, that connection, that togetherness. And then here is the language, the speakers. This is Lucy in a much younger day, as well as Nora. Nora is actually the one that used to come back east and speak. She was close to the last fluent speaker, and then Lucy was the very last one that I learned from. She died in 2000. And here are some more pictures of Nora. That's our traditional dress that we would have looked like if it had been in the East here. And here's what they look like in Oklahoma, wearing some pretty blankets and so forth. Some more of Lucy, and then the Delawares, about 20 years ago. And these are folks that, about half of them are still alive today, but you see Lucy right here. And Jim Rementer, who's done a lot of work with our language. And then you see her family. And this is Ruthie. So that's the artist that you see on the cover. That's her down there. And then Lucy, her mama. And then that's some of her other work. And lastly, I just want to express, these are two of our young women on the very far right they're younger here, but they're now today's adult women in their 20s and carrying on. And they're also doing work with language. What you see also with some of our younger generation is a much more trips back east here, mostly Pennsylvania, but we're seeing that strong urge to reconnect to our homelands. So I hope I didn't go too fast, but I did want to give you at least a spiel about who we are today. And I think we're going to go ahead and do our discussion at this point.
Thank you. Are you hearing me okay back there? Yeah, okay. Nicky, you mentioned to me that your grandfather, your father's father, was Irish. Mr. Michael was Irish. I mean, from him you get your phenotype. And you said to me that, we didn't talk about it much, so maybe it was understood, but you suspected he married your grandmother for the land, and that was happening a lot. Right. So, but my guess is that for many people, it would be unclear why that would be. That is, why would white settlers be interested in marrying Native women in Oklahoma? So,
right. So, like, just like what I was talking about with the guardianship of the young Delaware kids, basically, women were also targeted, and that's what you're going to see in Killers of the Flower Moon. But they would, not in a good way, target women to gain their land. And that was because it was called the Allotment Act, and it's called, it was also they were trying to civilize indigenous people. And civilize is a loose term, but what it meant back then was individual land ownership instead of having a communal land ownership with the tribe. And that each of the families, they had a head of household that got a part of that land, but an individual woman would also get a much smaller part, but she would also have some land. And so more than likely, yeah, I mean, that was one of those under the radar kind of statements in my family, and then they would say, well, we don't speak ill of the dead, because they don't want to say exactly what happened, but you get those vibes. And so I suspected it for 20 years ago.
It's striking to me, given how much intermarriage there was with especially male settlers, how much the traditions have remained alive. I mean, now the stories that are in the book were written down long before, around the time that her grandfather would have been marrying her grandmother, right? So those stories were written down at a time when the language was still vibrant, etc. But even now, I mean, when you interviewed elders in the 90s, some of them told stories that were the descendants of the stories that are in the book. And some of the stories in the book, written down in the early 1900s, resemble stories that the missionaries said the indigenous people, the Lenape people, told them in the 1700s. So these stories continue to be passed down, even to these elders that you were interviewing in the 90s. And the dancing, some of the dances that were described by people in the 16 and 1700s, very much look like the bean dance that is still done, etc. So in the context of all this intermarriage with these white male settlers, it's amazing to me how much of the culture was retained. And I guess I'm only now figuring this out. Are you saying that this is because the women made the efforts to do that, I mean, specifically?
Yeah, as the homemakers, as the basically the guardians of our families, that's what we did. I mean, and some of what doesn't come across in some of those interviews is, I mean, it would be a whole nother book about, how you bring outsiders into your culture. It's not an easy thing, and they're not going to have an easy time. But for the Delawares, I think because oftentimes we had, even in the 1600s, 1700s, when one of our one of our family members was killed somehow in war, oftentimes they wanted to replace that family member. And so, you would go raid a village and bring those
prisoner
captives
of war
back.
Right,
and then they, so I think it's a little bit of a kind of a trajectory from that.
I did notice that a couple of the women interviewed that appear in the book, your interviews from the 90s, they were elders then, so maybe they were born, say, in the 1920s, 1910s. A couple of them did say that their husbands got pretty good with the language, or he knew as much as I did. Now that can't be quite true, but still, they clearly were invested in having taught them a lot. Right? I don't know. It's quite interesting to me because how much survival there has been, despite the moves, and then in the last 100 years, despite the intermarriage, etc. Right?
Yeah, and I think every tribe's got to find that out for themselves, right? Like some tribes reject non-natives altogether, right? And they would never allow, somebody to come in and learn their ways. I think with the Lenape, I mean, for better or worse, the strategy just was to bring them to be Delaware rather than, assimilating outward towards the mainstream American.
And it does seem to have worked to some extent.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary, right? Okay. So, right. We hadn't decided, should we take turns? Like, do you want to ask me something now? Or, okay, we didn't make a plan.
I did want to ask you what struck you the most? What was surprising to you?
Do you mean in the stories or when I visited the Lenape country in Oklahoma?
How about both?
Both, okay. I think in the stories, what struck me the most is that their idea of a hero is so different from ours. I mean, our heroes have to be adventurous winners and usually male and very charismatic and handsome and buff. Our heroes are almost always like that. And their culture heroes made mistakes and laughed and learned, and they also sometimes did great things, but I was struck at how human they were, that the point of their being great seemed to be to show them learning and becoming sort of better and different than they were at the beginning of the story, which is really not typical of most sort of Western Americana, not at all. I'll have to think about it in terms of that's the most surprising thing. I guess another surprising element might be the humor. The stereotype of the stoical Indian, right? That really doesn't come through in the stories, that they're always interested in making a joke. But I guess I wasn't shocked by that element, because humor is the great weapon of the dispossessed, of the disempowered people. So what did I find most surprising about Oklahoma? I think actually the continuity of the songs and dances. And so on Thursday night, before their big powwow starts on Memorial Day weekend, they do just the traditional dances so that they can then just have a sort of wild pan-Indian fun for the next 3 days. But any kind of regalia, any kind of music goes. But Thursday is traditional. And not only did some of these dances match the descriptions, but people from all corners of the state and beyond had brought their kids. One particularly wonderful dance there, the women's dance, they follow a woman leader, and they stop every once in a while in the dance because it's a call and response. They're calling to the men who surround them and are beating on the drums. And they're speaking Lenape, and that story in Lenape was written down like 100 years ago somewhere else, and it's the story of a woman's child. No, she has died. Her child is alive, and she's calling to her husband, "Let me take the child with me," and to the land of the dead. And the father is sometimes she stops dancing, and the father, the husband, sings back, "No, he must stay here and live his life." Okay? Anyway, so they're dancing, and the woman, Sarah Boyd, it was actually, who was no longer in uniform, she was dancing away. She stopped, and everyone stops. That's part of the fun of the dance. And the little kids at the end don't know this is going to happen. They're like 3 or 7 years old, and so they would crash into the people right in front of them because they're still learning. But I guess what was so surprising to me but wonderful is people had come from all, some Delaware members who had moved to California and New York had come back for this. It is so important to them to have them still learn to sing this song, even if they're not taking your class and sort of relearning Lenape. They want them to at least learn to sing the song and dance the dance, to not break contact altogether. I guess maybe surprising isn't the word, but impressive? I don't know. I did not expect that. I expected to find people who knew that they were descended from the Lenape, but who didn't have any organic cultural connections still alive. And that I shouldn't have thought, because here I was, writing down these stories, transcribing the stories from the early 1900s. I should have known 2 or 3 generations later it would still be vibrant. But here in the East Coast, we're so dissociated from I would say, from active Native culture that it did surprise me. I don't know. Could you tell that I was disoriented sometimes, or no? No.
No, I was very impressed with her right away.
Okay.
Because
I did review.
yeah, well, how do I put this? Let's see. I did my history degree at OU with all male
Oh, did you? Okay.
I think I was the generation that came up and kind of broke through that glass ceiling of the old history person. And I'm trying not to offend anybody. But
the undergraduate students probably can't even imagine this world, but I remember it too when professors were men. And maybe a department would have a woman, maybe.
Maybe,
right.
yeah, there were two in ours. And of course they weren't on the native side, they were, so.
So I struck you as different from the professors.
Well, even that, I mean, you could still find women that would be arrogant about it, or even privileged about it. I think that's probably the better word. But you were very open to wanting to know and not overstepping any boundaries.
This reminds me, when we were on NPR a couple weeks ago, and Nicky hit the ball out of the park. But one of the questions they asked, and this may be a little touchy because we just had a land acknowledgement right here, but one of the questions that they asked on air, straight to Nicky, and she didn't know it was coming, she handled it beautifully, was, what do you really think of the land acknowledgements? Okay. Are you willing to talk about that here again? And Zimmerly staff, please understand she's not talking about the three of you. Okay, right.
Yeah, I think they're all well-intentioned. I mean, I don't think that they're a bad thing. I don't think we should stop doing them. But what I feel that we need to do is understand the context, and that the fact that we have Delaware's Lenape still alive today that once existed on this very place, and that many of them have never even been back here. Like, to me, I got to go see the river today. I was moved to tears. That's where my ancestors were in the canoes. This is where they prayed. This is where they danced. This is where they grew their corn. This is a place that we all wampum from. We don't get to see that.
And I would say from the people, from having been there so recently and talking to people, that the Lenape in Oklahoma are super conscious of that all the time.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
They feel Oklahoman, but they also feel displaced.
Oh yeah, there's 39 tribes in Oklahoma. Oklahoma was the dumping ground of Native peoples. That's where they put us so that they wouldn't have to deal with us anywhere else. And so that desire, that need to be able to go back and be able to touch the things like Kilbook, when that was my ancestor that signed that 1778 treaty. When I looked at it the first time, I knew that I saw that was his signature. Like the spirit, I mean, you could just feel that coming off of him. And to know I was in the same room with that was, it was a feeling beyond anything I could say.
So are you saying that although on one hand, of course, the land acknowledgements are a good thing, on another level, it almost makes, what you said on air was,
basically, there's another movement, it's called Land Back, and for a lot of us, we feel very frustrated that in acknowledging us, then we go on and do our thing. Everybody just goes back to doing what they were doing before, without even a drop of whatever it is, the microphone. You drop the mic, that's the feeling you get. You drop the mic, you walk out, well, nothing changes. We're still out there dealing with suicide. We're still out there dealing with kids that have very low incomes, that, barely can go to college. It's the social ills that have existed for having moved us 10 states away still exist today. And so
you were so eloquent, you are now too, but you said it's hard because sometimes I feel as though we're supposed to be grateful. I'm not putting it as well as you did, that, how did you put it, that these people who still are the beneficiaries of all that we have lost now want to be thanked for having acknowledgement, right? Which is not your motivation at all. But I have seen it done in that spirit. Sort of, aren't we virtuous? We are acknowledging, and that is hard to take. I would imagine. The poverty in Oklahoma is intense.
Yeah.
Many of you have probably seen it. Others have not. So there is a sense of loss, and the loss is real, right? So, there are more things I'd like to ask, but we should probably open it up too. But do you think so, Brendan? Yeah, more than time, or I don't know. Should I just keep asking her? Okay, she's the one we really want to hear from too. Okay, good. So one of the, there's so many experiences that you've had that I think are relevant to the ways in which the culture has been kept alive. I guess one thing I wondered about, you said that because so much of Lenape religion has been lost to us, despite the Shinkwak-Kon, and there are some ceremonies, there's some stories about the Shinkwak-Kon, which she was loosely translating as church, it means big house. Some of those stories have survived and are in the book, but so much has been lost. That you and your husband have taken to visiting other tribes, like the Lakota Sioux, and participating in their ceremonies, just to learn more about some Native American. Would you say that visits to other tribes or interactions with other tribes have been, I've never asked you this before, so maybe you'll say no, but have they been important to you in terms of maintaining some sense of indigeneity, even when much of Lenape lore has been, much has lasted, but much of Lenape lore has also been erased?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when they're talking about sending the boys out for their visions. That was a rite of passage, that women had their own rites of passage, and they could get visions, but men were, boys become men on purpose by sending them out for 2 or 3 days, if not longer, on those visions. And so, if I had, again, I have 6 boys, so if I had sent one of those boys out in the forest, I guess that's the best way to say it, somewhere where there wasn't a lot of resources and that they couldn't just go to the grocery store to get something to eat. They actually had to stay there and fast for a number of days. What do you think would have happened to me?
The Department of Human Services would have come for you, right?
Exactly.
So you end up having to read about it, or read to your boys about how it used to be, or connect with others.
Yeah. And again, there are 39 tribes in Oklahoma. Oklahoma doesn't have many places to go do that. However, other tribes like the Lakota or the Dakota have places that they can do that, and they actually still have maintained those.
I did not know that. Right.
The lechas, and that's what they call it, the lecha. And then they Sundance, and so some of those, again, the Sundance, and here's the thing, they pierce. There's a big difference between some of the Sundances in Oklahoma where the piercing was outlawed. Well, Sundances were outlawed, but they were finally able to get them back, but the law was they couldn't pierce, meaning for the men, they would pierce them through right here. And then they would be connected to the tree for a number of days, or if they chose maybe one day, that would be fine, but they could do it all 4 days as well. And so they would understand what that life was. They were connected to that tree. And that energy.
You and your husband have gone to the Umbleche, I think, right? Or did I? Yeah. So it is. I mean, it's not a casting back to Lenape culture, but it is in the sense helping you understand Indigenous religion that your great-grandmother knew all about, but you don't.
Right. So, but here's the other thing. Most people think of our tribes as like we were separated from each other. Well, the Sundance was shared by most of the Plains tribes,
right?
Right, and they gave it to each other. Well, we had the same thing in the Northeast and the Northwest. People ask us all the time, like, how do you have an alligator dance? Well, we love our alligator dance. It's so much fun. We don't have alligators in the Northeast. I mean, how do you have? Well, because we interacted with those from
with neighbors, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, we were always getting together. Now, do we have enemies? Yeah. And that's a whole nother subject, because we had war, and it was a whole different outcome. I mean, it was supposed to be a contest of, it could be, if it was a southeastern tribe, it would be stickball. And stickball is a lot like lacrosse, but stickball, they would be very violent, and that took the place of war. But they didn't have to kill everybody to win the war.
Yeah, we were talking about this earlier, how in a number of different cultures, sometimes tensions could be sublimated into sort of violent sports contestations. Not always, sometimes broke into actual warfare.
Right.
Sometimes, right. Yeah, no, I, as I've gotten to know you, I think I've come to have some sense of connections with other tribes, reading about other peoples, but also visiting and going to different ceremonies, talking to different people, that has helped you understand. And I would argue that that really is a way back to understanding. I understand that all the tribes are different, but my God, the commonalities are, I think, sometimes greater than the differences, and we sometimes have lost track of that. I know certainly in researching the stories, I was struck by how similar many of the Lenape stories were to those of Iroquois and other people who had been their neighbors at one time or another, which makes perfect sense, because through warfare, trade, and visits, there had been a lot of sharing. So there was sort of kind of a cultural grammar that root that seems to have been held in common. I don't mean to universalize or say that all Native Americans are the same, but I think it's a good instinct that you have, and I hope many other people begin to do that too, because so many tribes have lost so much of their stories. Okay? I wouldn't want to argue that the story writers' generation were the very last. Look at all the people like Nicky who are keeping the language and the customs going, but a lot has been lost since then, as they well knew. I mean, that's why Charlie Elker and his wife, et cetera, the people I showed, were so eager to talk to the anthropologists and get this written down. And it never was at that time, but I like to think that they would be happy with the book that exists now. And at least the Elkers have great-grandchildren who are able to see the book and happy that it has finally come out. I think Harrington the anthropologist did intend to turn them into a book, but then he never did. One thing led to another, and he never did. So that moment was very important. They recognized it as such, that I think they grasped that they were going to be probably close to the last generation of full speakers, although Lucy Blela and others did live longer. So it's good that it was written down when it was. It's good that it's published now, but I'm just, I can't tell you how moved I am, I guess, at the efforts that the Lenape have made over all these generations to keep the knowledge of the past and of the culture alive, okay? And that you are doing your best to do, okay? And her kids, 6 kids, can you imagine? Taking in 3 more when you've already got 3, all boys. The only girls are the kitty cats, right? Okay.
Yeah. So, girl cat.
Now, Brandon, seriously, there are more things I could ask her, but I really do think we should make sure that the audience has a chance. Does that make sense? And she'll be here if people want to ask her, even beyond the Q&A now. There are other things that can be brought up. Right? So, or maybe not. You're all very quiet. No, there is a hand up. Madeline? Yeah? Okay.
Thank you. I love the talk so far, very interesting. I just had a question about how you're teaching the language. I find like the recovery from a dying language very fascinating. So I was wondering how your tribe is dealing with that as a whole, and also you, how you're trying to bring it back. Yeah.
Okay, that's a great question, and I thank you for asking that. After Lucy passed,
The mother of the artist who did the cover.
Yeah, Lucy, I had been visiting her for years at that point, and yeah, I was very depressed. It threw me into a really, I didn't recognize it as such at the time, but it threw me into tailspin. It was like, okay, is this all on a few of our shoulders? Because there were some partial speakers as well. It wasn't just me, but it was like, I had been the formal one because I had went through both OSU and OU allowed me to use it as my quote foreign language, and so that was a breaking moment. It's never been used since, and it's yeah. I mean, but I didn't want it to be the only one. We're hoping it will, someone else will want to do it. But we're also struggling with the folks that try to claim it as theirs. So we'll get to that in a second. But for now, what we did do, and this is the Jim Rementer story of somebody who comes into a community and does nothing but report elders. And he had been there since the 1960s. And so he had so many recordings. And thank goodness he did that. He wasn't a Delaware. He was from Pennsylvania. Yeah. I don't know what got into, but you know, some things happen, and whatever was in his inner self got him out there, and he interviewed all of them. And then we put this in what's called the Lenape Talking Dictionary.
You can Google it, Madeline. Lenape
Yeah,
Talking
if you have your
Dictionary. Very
phone,
cool. Right.
you can get on it. So and I spent a number of years after that isolating those words of those elders, and so you hear the elders saying them, not just, you know, now Jim spoke some, and you know, mine is still going to be from a second language perspective, because I'll still, I mean, even Wanishi, like if you go to Oklahoma, they'll say Wanishi.
Thank you.
It is a very, oh yeah, it means thank you. It's a very oaky kind of like drawl to it, and so you're always going to have that, but it should be Wanishi, and there's other words very much like that where we tend to, when you're relearning them, those are the things you're going to deal with. But like other languages now that are coming back, we realize, well, you're a kindergartner, you're a first grader, you're not going to come in with knowing how it works. You have to understand you're going to be a student, and a lifelong student at that, because there's really no one else to converse with unless you get a group of you doing it together.
And you've had moments where there was such a group and then it dissipates as you get tired.
I have noticed this ebb and flow of, like, you know, the motivation and the groups coming together. But what I do feel like is that overall, my generation ends up being the bridge for our younger people. And so my kids today, our kids today, are taking it to a whole new level. And they're actually texting each other in Lenape.
Really?
Wow. The one problem we do have, and this is the conundrum of a lot of languages, especially indigenous languages, and why they might be sleeping versus dying, is that they're stuck in this 1800s because that's what it was in the 1800s. You didn't have airplanes flying over. You had wagons. You had all the wildlife. You had and plus the values of a particular culture. So I was telling Camille last night that the Hopi, for instance, have over 100 words for water. Blackfeet, I should say. No, it's Blackfoot, sorry. They have pretty much like 90 words for bison, for all the, you know. So that alone tells you the kind of values that are in a particular language. Well, if you try to push that through today, you're not going to have all those things. You're not even going to understand some of it unless you have speakers today that know what that means. But to modernize a language is very difficult. So if I worked up at Bemidji State for a number of years and worked with the Ojibwe. Their words are like 20 syllables long, and that's all just for a sugar cookie.
But because it's still a living language, I think you're saying it has, quote, modernized, it's moved with the times, they've created words for sugar cookie as languages do.
Or a computer.
Right. But in Lenape, all of that would literally have to be invented. So it can't, in that sense, it can't probably become a daily language.
Some tribes have an elders council, and they say, okay, we'll use that word, we'll accept that word. What I found really strange with the Ojibways is they don't have an elders, and they have a whole lot of Ojibways. So, but they seem to agree on whatever word that somebody decides is that word. Lenape, we would fight with each other. I guarantee we would fight with each other. So we haven't crossed that bridge yet. We probably will have to, but the younger generation, I feel like, will. And then let me also just add one more thing. with that is we have an example of the Uchis. The Uchis are a language isolate. They have nobody else to help them. And basically, they were down to 1 or 2 speakers about 5, maybe 15 years ago. So it's kind of loosely in that area. And today, they have after concentrating for a number of years on just their language, everything was, all their resources, all their time was put into revitalizing the language. They now have young people growing up with Yuchi as their first language. So it can happen, and it probably will, but it's going to take a lot of effort, and people have to put that as the priority over working.
And that can't really happen in large numbers,
Right. So, like, if I were to leave and go to another, and this is the problem with teaching and being an American Studies professor, you know, I'd have to leave in order to get the kind of income that I need to feed 6 boys.
and to attain the energy that would go into attaining full fluency in a language.
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't know how optimistic a story we can tell, Madeline, but you can tell lots of people around the country are really trying to at least keep it alive so that they can at least read some of the old stories that are still in the archives, etc. So it's at least that. Donna?
Thank you. Question on the thing. I definitely appreciate the word sleeping a lot.
Yeah, that was a nice way to put it. The language of sleeping.
I was thinking about it when I was thinking about the question. I was like, I don't know about this word, but
It was a good.
It's a great metaphor, right? Okay.
So thank you both very much. It's wonderful to hear you speaking about this. And so it occurred to me as you were talking about, the importance of reviving Lenape language and teaching the children. Do you have plans to is this book in Lenape?
No, although in the appendix there are a couple of stories in Lenape and English, but no, the whole thing is in English. Okay? Nicky has a great idea for another book, which might involve more than that is have one story in English and Lenape, and then we could have multiple chapters about different elements of just that story. There's an extraordinary story called The Ball Player. It's in the book. And there's so much in there when you stop and think about it, about women's history, about the ball game, about the warrior as an ocelot or a wild cat, about people's spirit animals that they become attached to during the period of the boys being out in the wild. There's so much profundity in this one story. And we tend to, like this book does, we tell a few stories and they're very interesting and they're very sweet and people like them. But except for a few literary scholars who do sort of highly theoretical analysis of folklore, there isn't much sustained attention paid to each story and all that is there in terms of morality, but also the substance of the people's culture. So we're thinking of doing a book that would be about all that is in one story. But it would ultimately still be in English. We might put the story there in Lenape, but to turn it into a book that actually comes on the language. The problem is there are so few speakers left that there isn't much of an audience for that. That's why in this book it's consigned to the appendix. I don't think Peter Makulis here from the press would have agreed to publish it if we said, and we want them in Lenape.
We can talk about this next.
Okay, right, okay.
But you can get on the Talking Dictionary, and there are some stories on there in Lenape.
Yes,
so that's
right.
the best place to go and listen and hear those original speakers.
I don't know this gentleman or woman's name. Oh, Kate, it's Kate. Okay, sorry.
Hi, Professor.
Hi.
I really appreciated what you said about land acknowledgements, and I totally see your point. And I don't think it's fair for us as New Jerseyans to put it then back on the indigenous people that we've disempowered to be well, what do you want us to do? But at the same time, in your ideal world, what role would you see New Jersey and the New Jersey government playing in helping bring indigenous people back to New Jersey, reconnecting, like you were talking about, and having that spiritual experience?
She's got an idea, an exchange program. Go ahead, tell them about this. And we'll have to ask the students would they do it. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I don't know if you all know much about Bacone College, but I know some of you do. But Bacone is an Indigenous serving institution, and we could do an exchange system of students. So for instance, I don't know, but I suspect because it's back east that you don't have a whole lot of folks teaching Indigenous studies. And so we have all of our classes that pretty much are embedded in that philosophy, in Indigenous philosophies. And I'm not saying that's one, there's multiple. And so we would be able to share in those classes by sharing, some of the students and allowing them to take those classes. Well, and of course the resources here are far, far beyond anything we could do at Bacone. It's just a small place, and we're always poor. We run out of money often. People go without payroll even. That's what I'm saying. Like when I say broke, I mean $0. And so that's often new to people in an education institution. And so that would be a wonderful way to kind of exchange and share some of those resources with us. But of course, we also, as a tribe, I should tell you, I'm not a tribal council member at present. I know at the time we were writing the book,
You still
I was.
were, but now she stepped down.
Yeah, because I don't want anybody getting mad at me when I go back, like, you're shut up. But what I do know is that they are hungry to be out here. Our kids especially love it when they get to come here and just enjoy life. And again, the resources here would make things much, much better for our kids growing up. And there's plenty of places to also be able to contribute if you get on our website. And I hate to always say it's money, but we're living in an economic system that we didn't invent, that we didn't want, and that we're now having to accept. And so that is, we can't do anything without it. We can't do the language programs if we don't have a certain amount of money.
And I do think actually Rutgers folks would be interested in donating, especially if they knew more about it. I mean, this would have to be done, I think, through study abroad, but technically it is, because it's on Muskogee or Creek land. So in theory, it would be a study abroad program, although you'd still be within the boundaries of the United States, but you'd be on reservation land. So do you think, Kate, would there be some interest? I'm not asking you, would you go necessarily, but do you think there would be students at Rutgers who would be interested in studying abroad by going to study on a tribal college on a reservation for one semester and studying Native art and Native culture, or do you think?
I would hope so.
Yeah.
I think that there definitely would be interest. At the same time, I think we both know that the history department isn't really the biggest concern of Rutgers right now, or ever. But at the same time, I think that if it was well advertised, and just thinking of the level of viewership that the Scarlet and Black program got, I think that if we get to that level, I think people will be interested.
So that more people heard about it. I mean, my sense, of course, I became a professor of Native history, so I guess I don't count, but my sense is, had anyone said to me as an undergraduate, you could study abroad by going to an American Indian reservation, I would have wanted to do that, but I guess we can try. We can float the idea and try, because it would be a way of actually exchanging, and then the young people there could come here. And once more people at Rutgers had heard that there were Lenape people out at this tribal college in Oklahoma, more might be interested in giving money too. I think even small amounts from an East Coast person can mean a lot in Oklahoma, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I can give you several of the pages where you can contribute if you wanted to.
Kate, that was a very nice question, and you did it well too. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for your reply.
Right.
Any more questions?
Is there time for one more, you said?
One more.
I'm taking my cues from the MC over here.
I know.
Right? Okay, right, okay. Maybe there are no more questions. Oh, yes, there is. Okay, right.
Yeah, I'm curious about the idea of church then. I've not heard the term used in particular in the culture of Native American
Big
culture.
house.
So could you talk a little bit more about
And
that?
why do you use the word church instead of just big house or shinguacon? Because it doesn't actually mean church. Is that just a way of explaining to people what it is instead of calling it a temple or a...
Well, Yeah, that was just the translation that they came up with because, again, nothing ever is going to directly translate, but they saw it as, well, okay, so those Shawanets, and we use that in the book, it's called Salt People. That's what the term for white people would go into this building and they would worship that person called Jesus. You know, so in our churches, this is what we would do. So that's why we would go into that church. However, church is used loosely, definitely, because we also have other dances that were more spiritual and they were outdoors. So say, for instance, the doll dance was outside, but it would still be considered a religious activity, as well as stomp dancing. But I also want to really emphasize that there's a difference between spirituality in most of our activities, our dances, and religion. And so those were just probably the closest they could come up with the terms that fit.
Thank you.
Yeah, it startled me too when she called it a church, right?
Yeah, definitely not the we're worshiping Jesus.
Yeah, in fact,
This
it was real strange because they were mad at the people who become Christians, the people who become Christians were mad at them, right? So
yeah, it ebbs and waves. There were times that they did accept Christianity, and there are plenty of times we kicked it out too.
Different waves of missionaries came and were rejected, right?
So I think we should thank our speakers and continue conversation over the reception in the back of the room.
Thank you all.
Thank you.